What's going on, guys? Zuko back with another Last Epoch video. Hope you're all doing super well. I'm going to do a follow-up video to the damage over time video that I just released yesterday. Had some really great comments underneath the video and some good discussion on how there's lots of abilities in Last Epoch that actually deal damage over time that are not ailment related. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about some channeled abilities. But yeah, mostly abilities that are going to deal damage to enemies that do not actually have any relation to ailments whatsoever. Things like Tornado and some other abilities I'm gonna showcase for you. So this is important to understand because you will also need to be getting damage over time on your gear or on the skills themselves in order to scale them. And there are some very unique scaling sort of abilities, for each of the different skills you're using. So some of them scale off of like attunement. Some of them will scale off of how many locusts you have out for the Swarm Blade. I'm going to talk about that one in a minute. Some of them might scale off of the amount of poison stacks that you have on an enemy, which will change the hit damage of the damage over time ability. And then there's a lot of different really cool things that we're going to get into. So let's just dive right into it. We're going to start off first by talking about, what are some of the abilities to do damage over time. For example, Primalist has lots of damage over time abilities. Number one, let's look at Tornado. This is an ability that does damage over time, but also hits an enemy, okay? And you can actually make this apply ailments to enemies per hit. We're going to look at this video right here. I just took this a minute ago. This is a fire tornado that I have. This is hitting enemies, okay? It has on-hit damage, okay? Which means, and it's also a spell, it's a spell, which means it's going to apply, if you get added spell damage, it will actually buff the damage over time of this ability, okay? Does that make sense? So what I said yesterday in terms of ailments, your spell damage will not buff your ailments, but spell damage for Tornado will buff its on-hit damage as it's spinning. Every second it goes ding, 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 ding. It's like it's hitting enemies actually more often than a second. So this is a really interesting thing to think about. So you can scale the damage of Tornado itself. The actual hit damage can be scaled with damage over time on your gear, and if it's applying ignites like I am right here, then you're also scaling the ignite damage. So you're kind of double dipping there. Okay, so it's really important to understand. You can also scale Tornado specifically with spell damage, as I said, increased spell damage because it is a spell. So you can also scale it with physical damage, or if you turn it into a fire tornado, you can scale it with fire damage. So for example, this staff right here, it has melee damage, which is not helping me, but it has flat spell damage on it, plus 74. That is helping my damage over time on Tornado, okay? Very different than an ailment. Ailments do not scale with flat spell damage or flat melee damage ever, but in the case of Tornado, it's going to scale the damage over time it does as it's spinning, okay? And then on top of that, I can apply ignite if I want to, and then I'm also, this spell damage here is not going to apply to that ignite that I'm putting on the enemies, but percentage fire damage down here will apply to the ignite and to the upfront hit that Tornado is doing, okay? So this can get really complicated with some of these abilities, and it can be really hard to sort of understand what's going on. You can see my Tornado per second is doing 23 something. If I put this axe on, it goes all the way down. This axe gives me % increased physical damage, which is good for Tornado, for the hit of Tornado. That is buffing its damage, but the minion physical is bad. The melee is the plus 74 melee physical. That is not helping my Tornado because it's a spell. So when it comes to Tornado specifically, you're looking at spell damage and then added physical damage. If you turn it into a fire spell, you want added fire damage instead. That's going to severely boost the damage of your Tornado. But it's just important to understand each individual skill that you are looking at. You need to understand how it scales in terms of its damage over time, because they're all like radically different, okay? They really are. You can see underneath here it says Tornado added damage applies to the damage over time at 75% effectiveness per second. So it actually has decent scaling there. And then we also have attunement scaling. So Lots of damage over time abilities in the game will scale with other modifiers, such as stats. You can see the attunement scaling here is giving me 4% increased damage per point of attunement. I have a ton of attunement on this guy, I think. Yeah, I have 64, so I'm getting a lot of damage out of that. So increased damage applies to damage over time. It applies to ignites or bleeds. It applies to basically everything. So increased damage is good. But just be aware that you need to really do the research on your ability and see what is going to scale this sucker. Let's look at Scorpion for a second as well. Scorpion's another great example. So this does poison damage. This Scorpion has an ability where he hits people with his tail, and it inflicts a long poison all on its own. You can also add chance to poison over here, and then increase damage with poison. And then he can get another modifier that makes him deal more damage per stack of poison on the enemy. So these are all damage over time things. You're scaling your damage over time that way. He can also lob an acid flask, or acid lob, actually. It's not a flask, acid lob. It's a ranged spell that explodes and deals poison damage over time. And then you can also create a pool with Venom Nova. It can create a big pool on the ground. I think it's over here. Here it is. Poison pool for a duration, which puts stacks of poison on the enemy. So, like, with the Scorpion, if you just get lots of damage over time, you're going to be scaling all these different things. Your lob will do more damage. The pool will do more damage. The Venom Nova will do more damage. All that kind of stuff. And if we hold Alt on him, he also has strength scaling. If you get strength, he gets 4% increased damage per point. So again, another way to scale him. Let's look at Swarmstrike. I'm going to pull up the next video here. This is another very different example. Very, very good one here. So this is on the Druid. If you get Swarmstrike, this is a very unique thing. So for the Swarm Blade, you put down your little hives, and they summon locusts. And then the locusts you can consume with Swarmstrike. It will consume those locusts and make this little area around you deal more damage over time. So you can see I'm just running around just killing things because it's doing damage per second. I'm going to consume my locusts here. In a second, watch them all pop out. Right here, there's a whole bunch of them on the ground. They're going to disappear in a second. There, boom, I hit it. I consume a bunch of locusts. I deal more damage over time. Now, I am actually dealing melee damage over time. And this gets added damage effectiveness based on my melee damage. So we're going to look, if I hold Alt here, you can see this. It has strength scaling, so again, 4% more increased damage. It also has attunement scaling. I can scale both of those. That'll scale the damage over time, attunement and strength. Now, the big thing here is look at the bottom. For each locust consumed, the swarm gains plus 15 flat melee physical, plus 15 flat melee poison, 15% increased duration, 15% increased area. Added melee damage applies at 350% effectiveness to the initial hit and 300% per second to the swarm. So adding flat melee damage to this specific ability will buff your damage over time. The damage that it deals when you're just roaming around, okay? This little swarm circle around me is getting more damage based on my flat melee damage that I'm adding. So that is really important to understand. There are some abilities that are just incredibly they're just very, very different in terms of the way that they scale. You need to check it out. Do the research. Hold Alt when you're looking at the ability, and it will help you understand what you need to be doing in terms of how to scale that ability. There's lots of different ways to scale this stuff, but it's just always important to understand exactly how to do it for the specific ability that you're working with. Like, spell damage for Tornado will actually scale your damage over time. Melee damage for Swarm Blade, flat melee damage, will actually scale your damage over time for that circle ability. And then, of course, the number of locusts you consume will also scale it. So in your talent tree, you might want to buff the amount of locusts that you're spawning so that you can consume more of them so you get more damage over time. Do you see how that kind of works? So, yes, when it comes to ailments in this game, ignite, bleed, poison, damned, all that stuff, it does not scale with flat damage modifiers like flat melee, flat spell damage. But some of the other abilities that are skills that do damage over time, they will scale off that. And as always, attack speed and cast speed are very, very good choices. obviously with these kinds of abilities, you don't have to worry about like chance to apply ignite or chance to apply anything. They don't. It's nothing about that at all. Maelstrom, for example, it just deals damage over time. You're not applying any ailments here. It just does damage over time. So you don't have to worry about applying a chance to apply anything. What you do need to worry about, though, is like cast speed and attack speed. Those are going to increase the rate at which your damage over time abilities are doing their damage, okay? For example, Warpath is a great example. Let me zip over to my... Okay, so let's look at Warpath here. So Warpath is a Sentinel ability. It is a channeled ability. We're going to start talking about channeled abilities just for a second here. Channeled abilities, by definition, do damage over time because they are... You are spinning and you're hitting things over time as you hold down that channel button, okay? Same with, like, the Warlock has their Ghost Flame. You know, you're spitting flame at enemies. That's damage over time. So if we hold Alt, we can see that Warpath does damage over time, but then there's a bunch of extra modifiers to look at the bottom. You have 20% less movement speed while you're spinning. Your hits at twice your attack rate, but added damage applies at 60% effectiveness. There is a 40% less chance to apply ailments on hits. So Warpath can apply ailments. It can apply things like the Void. I think it might be able to apply Doom, actually, but there's Time Rot there. You can see there's Time Rot, and that's like if you were doing a Void Knight, you could do a spinning Void Knight and apply damage over time with your Time Rot, and then you'll do more damage over time with your Warpath. You're double dipping there once again, like I was talking about Tornado. Typically speaking, with channeled abilities, you never ever have any mana regeneration while you're channeling. I've looked at a lot of different spells. I have not seen one where you get mana back while channeling. It is a part of the build you have to solve. How do you get your mana back once you're done channeling? Okay, the only exception would be like the mage spell where you can channel for a bit to get your mana back, the focus spell, right? So that's obviously very different. But typically any DPS spell or ability that is going to be channeled, you do not get mana back while you are channeling that spell, okay? But they all have very specific modifiers. For example, getting attack speed on Warpath is really, really critical because it hits... This thing will hit at twice your attack rate. So the more you scale your attack speed, the more this thing will hit. The more times per second it will hit an enemy, which means the more times per second you can apply an ailment, or just the more times per second it's dealing damage, which is great. You want to be doing damage as often as you possibly can. So remember, obviously, as I said, just to make sure you check the actual tags, see what each individual ability does, see how it scales, because it's going to be really important to understand that. Obviously, getting damage over time on your gear is always going to be a good stat for anything that is channeled or anything that deals damage over time. That's very, very important. But there's other modifiers like strength and attunement and potentially getting like Locust, for example, that are going to scale as well. Let's look at Judgment. I already had it open here. Judgment is another, this is obviously a paladin ability. So you can see right here, this is a very unique ability. It smacks the ground and it leaves consecrated ground on the ground there. If you're in there, you're getting healed per second. If enemies are in the consecrated ground, they're taking fire damage per second. That scales with spell damage. Consecrated ground gains 1 spell damage per 5% increased healing effectiveness. So you can scale the spell damage of Judgment by increasing your healing effectiveness, which is really wacky, right? But that's what, you know, Paladin's all about. And then you can see at the bottom you get strength scaling, attunement scaling, added melee damage applies at 350% effectiveness, added spell damage applies to the consecrated ground. So if you wanted to do a full consecrated ground damage over time build, you would need to scale your spell damage here and your healing effectiveness. Those are both going to buff the damage over time that is happening with Judgment. So again, it can get really complicated. It can get really wacky, and you need to just hold Alt on your abilities. It's the best thing you can do. Look at the bottom of the ability and see exactly what is going on to help you understand how to scale your channeled abilities or your damage over time abilities that are not related to ailments. Remember, ailments like Ignite or Time Rot or Frostbite or Electrify, those do not scale with flat damage, flat spell damage, flat melee damage. They scale with damage over time, increased damage, like I talked about in the other video. These special abilities, like Judgment's damage over time, or Warpath, or the Swarm Blade thing that I was talking about, they will scale. They do have a chance, depending on the tooltip, to scale with flat damage or flat spell, you know, melee damage or spell damage. You just have to look it up and figure out exactly how to take your ability to the next level. And then you might also want to double dip. get some of those abilities like Tornado, where you're scaling your spell damage and potentially your damage over time into like Ignite, because if you make your tornadoes hit faster, then they're going to add Ignite, but you're also getting the spell damage, which is adding damage to the tornado itself. If you get damage over time, you're adding damage to both the upfront hit of Tornado and the ignites that it's adding to enemies. So it's a really cool. There's a lot going on with damage over time in terms of this game, and it's just something that you're going to have to take a look at, dig really deep, and do the research. If you have any more questions, definitely ask me down below in the comments. Let me know if I missed anything once again, and join the Discord if you want to show me some pictures or if you want to talk about it more. We have a channel in the Discord. Jump over there. It's in the link down below. Thank you guys so much again for watching. I love you all. I will see you in the next one.